Now, verse 8, 9, and 10 also form a trio of a sort because there's verse 9 links these together with the story of Michael. But let's take a look at each verse in turn. It says, in the same way, so again, still referring to the false teachers, it says, on the strength of their dreams, that is, they were probably having some kind of, or they were claiming to have prophetic dreams, likely. So, on the strength of these so called prophetic dreams, these ungodly people, they pollute their bodies, likely a reference to some kind of a sexual sin going on there. They reject authority. Again, this is a theme, rejecting the sovereignty of the Lord. Angels leaving their positions of authority. So there's this incorrect way of viewing authority and particularly rejecting God's authority. And then it says they heap abuse on spiritual beings. In the Greek, this is quite literally, they blaspheme the glories. The word for spiritual beings is just the word glory in plural. So the glorious beings or celestial beings, whatever it is, they are heaping abuse on celestial beings. Jude now gives an example or expansion on that. He says, even the archangel Michael, when he was disputing with the devil about the body of Moses, did not himself dare to condemn him for slander, but said, the Lord rebuke you. Now, you may say to yourself, I don't remember this story in the Bible, and the story, written as such, does not appear in the Bible. This is likely a reference to a book called The Testament of Moses or The Assumption of Moses. We don't actually have the whole text of that, and we don't have this particular story from the text. There was a text called The Testament of Moses. We don't have any of that text or where exactly this is from. So we sort of have to put the pieces together. And the pieces are that we have references to this book which describe this story. Now, there are components of the Bible that you can piece together to get this story, although, again, it does not appear. What do we do have? Well, we do have the story of the death and burial of Moses. The text says that God buried Moses. He buried him, is what it says, and this was an honor for him to receive. We also know about the archangel Michael from like the book of Daniel. He is described as a powerful spiritual being, an archangel, sort of like a lead angel there. And we know that the devil sometimes plays this role of accuser, like in the book of Job or in the book of Zechariah, chapter 3, for instance. And we have a quote, the Lord rebuke you, is actually found, those words are found in Zechariah 3, where the devil is playing an accusatory role. And so what we can piece together from all that information is that there was a legend that said when God was burying Moses, the devil came and said, you should not give Moses this honor because he is a sinful man. And the particular accusation was with regards to the Egyptian that Moses killed. And that the archangel Michael was there present and did not rebuke the devil, but instead said, the Lord rebuke you, sort of leaving it up to the mercy of God. So that's the story that is likely being referenced, or that Jude is referencing. He would have had access to that Testament of Moses, quite likely, and so he is referencing that as a story, which is an illustration of what we see in verse 8, and then moving on, it sort of forms a link with verse 10. So let's move on to verse 10. It says, these people, they slander, and again, remember, this was heap abuse, the same word, they slander what they do not understand. And I think what they do not understand is the celestial beings here. And the very things they do understand, so there is a set of things they do understand, but they understand these things by instinct as irrational animals. Those things are destroy them. So they are painted in this picture of acting like beasts, acting on instinct. So they are things that they do understand. They understand their sort of carnal base desires, and those things will actually destroy them, which again was the pattern theme of what is coming to the end of these false teachers. Now we have to kind of go back and say, okay, looking at these three verses together, what's up with this heaping abuse on spiritual or celestial beings, slandering what they don't understand? Like, why is that wrong? And there's a couple of possibilities. You know, one is just they're sort of playing with fire that they don't understand, right? Powerful beings, and so they're going to get themselves in trouble. Another possibility here is that it's another form of rejecting God's authority. What we know elsewhere in Scripture is that the law was given through angels. I mean, the giving of the law, I should say, was mediated through angels, and we actually see that in various places in the New Testament that like my mind sort of skips through, but it's stated very clearly in the New Testament that that's what's going on, and so a rejection of angelic beings or power of angelic beings or celestial beings, even apparently in like a dispute where the celestial being is bad, there's still a component of rejecting or abusing celestial beings is a form of rejection of authority, which is the pattern that we see of these false teachers and the way that they are trying to lead people astray in the church. So I think it mostly has to do with another form of rejecting authority. So now we move on to verse 11, which is yet another trio, because once again, Jude gives us three biblical texts to look at. And the first one is it's a woe. This is a whole woe. It's the story of Cain is number one. And then Balaam's error. And then third is Korah's rebellion. So what's going on in those stories? Well, of course, Cain killed his brother Abel. And really, another way to look at it is he then goes out and he establishes a city, and that city becomes another root of evil that occurs as things lead up to the flood. Lead up to the flood. So Cain is not only violence, but his sort of actions spur more violence. The story of Balaam, when you read Numbers, he for a little while he kind of comes across as a good guy because he refuses to just speak on his own. He speaks to the Lord. Now, later in the story, you learn that Balaam was actually behind the plot to seduce Israel to follow other idols, which actually led to God's judgment. So Balaam was not a good dude, and he seemed to have done this at the end of the day, Balaam's error, and it was something that was for profit. And then finally, Korah's rebellion is when Korah, who was one of the one of the Levite tribes, basically said, "Hey, I know we have a position of authority or of honor as Levites, but we want more. We want to be like the priests, like Aaron's priests." And so they rebel against Moses, and the land swallows them up. And I think one thing all these three have in common is that they are both people doing wrong, violence, profit, rejection of authority, but also that things that are going to actually lead the whole nation or the whole world into sin as well. So again, that's the nature of these false teachers, is they are sinning themselves and they are leading others into sin. Now let's take a look at verse 12. Again, he's describing these false teachers, and he says that they are blemishes at our love feasts. This word, blemishes, is unclear exactly which Greek word is here. And you'll notice that some translations say blemishes. Some translations will say they are hidden reefs. And that's because the Greek words are very similar, and there is a First Peter passage or a Second Peter passage that parallels this, where the word is clearly blemishes. Seems like the Jude text is maybe, I would tend to side with the whole hidden reefs, but regardless, they are causing problems at these love feasts. Love feasts are basically an old form of what we would call the Lord's Supper. But there's probably more of a feasting component to it, a larger meal, but in that there was also the remembering of the Last Supper. And they do this without qualm or without fear. They're doing it irreverently. And then they are called shepherds who feed only themselves, which is likely a reference to a passage in Ezekiel where God is accusing the shepherds that are supposed to be caring for the sheep for only caring for themselves, eating the sheep instead of caring for the sheep. So these guys are pretending to be shepherds. They're pretending to be pastoral type figures, but in fact, they're just out for their own gain. And then what we have in verse 12 and 13 is we have clouds, autumn trees, wild waves, and wandering stars. So we have four sort of metaphors from nature, and they sort of encompass all of it, right? So we've got what's in the skies above, and then we've got the natural trees, and then we have the seas, and then we have the stars, which are sort of heavens above. And all of these evoke an image of things that are acting, they are doing things, right? We've got clouds, but they don't have any rain. There's no rain, right? They look good, but they're doing nothing. We've got trees, but you know what? They're without fruit and they're uprooted. In fact, they're twice dead. So again, not producing anything. Twice dead may be a reference to also to their judgment. And then we've got the wild waves of the sea, lots of action, and they are doing something, but what they're doing is they're foaming up their own shame. All that gunk from the bottom of the ocean, they're pulling it up, and it's just these shameful acts. And then we have wandering stars. Again, the wandering stars. This is actually probably just a reference to planets. The wanderers, the wandering stars, that they're not following their what they're supposed to do. They're not following their course from a sort of certain perspective. They're wandering off on their own, and so they're leading potentially leading people astray, things like that. There's also a good chance that again Enoch talks about these fallen angels as wandering stars, as a sort of illustration of what it means to be disobedient to God. And it says that what's the end? There's a lot of discussion of the judgment here for these wandering stars, which again may be a reference to sort of fallen angelic beings. The blackest darkness has been reserved forever. Now, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on verse 14 and 15 because I already talked about them earlier. But again, Jude quotes from the book of Enoch. He respects enough to say prophesied. That doesn't mean that we should view the book of Enoch as authoritative. It was not viewed as authoritative as the letter was, as the canon was being discussed. It was not part of that. There is a small part of the Ethiopic church which does view it as authoritative, but that is certainly a minority position. But certainly Jude respects it and finds it compelling and believes his audience will also find it compelling. The description here is of the final judgment, the Lord coming, thousands upon thousands of his holy ones. He's going to judge everyone. He's going to convict them all. There's this repetition of ungodliness. In the Greek, that's how things appear. The people are described as speaking defiant words against God. Again, that is a rejection of God's authority. Common theme in Jude. Verse 16 gives us another description of these false teachers. We learn that they are grumblers, they are fault finders, likely against the established leaders. They're trying to establish their own ground, so they're grumbling and finding fault. It says they're following their own evil desires. They boast about themselves, and they flatter others to their own advantage.